All right, let's go ahead and take a look at our next example for interpreting, in other words, identifying the type 1 and type 2 error in context. All right, so here's our example. Example 3, this should be an earlier example, where the college claims that the average textbook slash materials, cost for a class is $153.20. You believe this to be higher. Again, usually this comes because you are actually a student enrolled and you're like, wow, I do not believe this claim because I spent a lot of money on materials this semester. So again, that's the logic right there. So before you even try interpreting, make sure that you set up your hypothesis. So here we have the null hypothesis, which is that the claim that the average cost, so the average cost is 153.2. The alternative is that the mean is higher than 153.2. All right, now what does it mean to make a type 1 error in context? So let's go ahead and start by just writing out, do you reject or fail to reject? Remember, type 1 error, imagine alpha. And when you're setting up your hypothesis test and you're sketching this, you know that alpha is the probability of landing in the tail. In this case, it's a one-tail test, so alpha is concentrated here. So it would be an error for you to land in alpha, which means alpha would reject. Alpha rejects the null, right? Landing in that critical region. So if that's an error, it means you want to not land in that space. Okay, so this basically says you're making an error by rejecting the null. So that means the null is true, but we are rejecting it. So the evidence says that we rejected, and that's just because we landed in the tails. So this basically means that evidence indicates that H0 is false. In other words, we want to reject the null. Even though H0 is actually true. So that's the main idea for what a type 1 error is. Let's interpret this in context. So remember, in context, that means you want to use the verbiage that they're using. So they're talking about the average textbook slash material cost for a class and what it is. So you were saying that the evidence indicates that H0 is false. So in other words, we're going to say the mean cost is actually greater than. So evidence, so this could be your semester, indicates the mean cost of materials per class is greater than 153.2, when in reality, the mean cost is actually 153.2. So you just got a sample that was much higher than anticipated, but in reality, the mean cost is still 153. All right, let's interpret a type 2 error. First of all, let's identify what does it mean to make a type 2 error. So type 2 error happens when the null is not true. It's always the opposite of everything that we said. So type 1 error occurs when you reject the null. So therefore, a type 2 error is going to happen when you fail to reject them. And if that's an error, then that means that the null is actually false. So we should have rejected, but we did not. All right, let's go ahead and summarize that in context. So remember, it's all based on evidence. So our evidence indicates that, so let's see what happened. We failed to reject the null. So that means that my sample seems to support the null hypothesis. So evidence indicates that the mean cost is 153.2, when in reality, so if H0 is false, we're just going to go ahead and say that we were correct in alternative. The mean cost is greater than 153. All right, and there you have it. So in both of these cases, I don't think there really seems to be any like major drawback to type 1 and type 2 error. Let's go ahead and look at different kinds of not interpretations. This one was an interpretation. Now what I want to do is I want to say, given the conclusion, what kind of error is possible? This is important because this is what you're going to be asked in your lab. So take a look at, make sure you take a look at this example. Because given the following, what kind of error is possible? Okay, so that question is the question that's asked in your lab. All right, so here we go. Part A. It used to take an average of 30 minutes to find student parking at GCC, but we think we have sufficient evidence. So again, this is after we collect our evidence. We say that the time has decreased. Again, let's write out our hypothesis. So the time, so you used to take an average. Let's just use words. So the average time to park was 30 minutes. Remember, we think we have sufficient evidence to say that the time has decreased. So that means that we're actually supporting an alternative, which means that the average time is now less. So average time to park is less than 30. All right, so let's see what kind of error is possible. To answer this question, always go ahead and focus on the fact, like, what was your conclusion? Do you reject the null or do you fail to reject the null? Notice they say we have sufficient evidence. So that's when we reject the null, because we are supporting the alternative. So if you reject the null, so when does that happen? When do you reject the null and you get a wrong conclusion? Well, that happens when you should not reject the null. And remember that not rejecting the null essentially means that you make an error by landing in the tail. So that's a type 1 error. And we can see that by going up here to our graphic. If you ever forget, we are, in this case, essentially, we reject the null. And the only way that you can make an error is if you commit a type 1 error. So that means the null hypothesis is actually true, so don't reject it. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the last example. A diet claims you can lose 10 pounds in 1 week. That's pretty good for a diet. Okay, so the claim is, I'm pretty sure that's an average. So the average weight loss. So how do you spell weight? Weight. In 1 week is 10 pounds. The alternative is, I don't know, it doesn't tell me. So I'm just going to go ahead and kind of put a little box here. Could be not, could be less than, could be more than. All right, now what is our conclusion? So we are not able to reject. So that means that my sample evidence supports the null hypothesis. So we're saying, oh no, we don't have enough evidence to support the alternative. And so we're unable to reject, right? So that means we fail to reject. And it's pretty easy because we've already said that there's only one way to make an error. When you reject the null, the only way to make an error is with a type 1 error. When you fail to reject the null, the only kind of error that's possible is a type 2 error. So that means you should have rejected this claim, but your sample evidence just did not. So again, it could be like a really great, awesome weight loss program or really mediocre weight loss program. But either way, you're saying that it's, people can lose 10 pounds in 1 week. All right, and that's pretty much it. So again, we did one more example on interpreting type 1 and type 2 errors, and then we went ahead and identified the kind of error possible depending on the conclusion of the hypothesis test.